In August of 1988, two college juniors founded a comedic newspaper. They called their creation The Onion. 30 years later, the paper is a national juggernaut, surfacing satirical critiques of nearly everyone and everything. From challenging our obsession with scientific research and statistics, world mortality rate holding steady at 100%. Or, study reveals babies are stupid. To hilarious and scathing jabs at our society. Area liberal no longer recognizes fanciful, wildly inaccurate mental picture of country he lives in. And in its 3 decades of existence, one of the most read headlines regarding The Onion actually came from its readership this past year, declaring, "The Onion, on the verge of bankruptcy as reality eclipses satirical absurdity." Shakespeare asked the question, "Is not the truth the truth?" And what was, of course, rhetorical query is now up for debate. In 2016, the Oxford Dictionary word of the year was post-truth. Plenty has been written about truthiness and alternative facts and fake news. In an era in which most of us have come to assume that all politicians are liars, that any news source is biased, and that statistics are mere tools of manipulation, the image of this season as we stand before the judge of truth holds new weight. The results are apparent in the fractures and factions of our nation. Since its inception in 1972, the General Social Survey indicates that American trust of fellow Americans is at a historic low. Confidence in institutions, in scientists, in religion has never been lower. And according to Pew Research, the political partisan polarization is wider than it has been since 1879, the earliest year in our country for which there is data. For many of us, we have felt all of this in the most personal of ways. We have lost friendships and even familial connections. We have boycotted news sources and websites. At a time when we see the image of neo-Nazis gathering in public eye and babies ripped from the arms of their parents at our border, we see the range of emotions. And for so many of us, it becomes difficult to know how to muster anything but rage and disgust. Some of us have felt marginalized and silenced, others emboldened and heard. And whatever landscape of truth once invited us to find shared ground of humanity is certainly now diminished. And for many of us, as we look across the country, across party lines, across the pew, we find only allies or enemies, a bifurcated battle of belief. And more than ever, I believe that Judaism is a gift for this moment and at this time, and our tradition's teachings on truth may be the most important lessons of our age. Our early sages faced a Jewish world upended by the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. With Jewish community destabilized and dispersed, they had to craft a new sense of truth that could cohere a fragmented Judaism. And this was their imagination of truth. Rabbi Shimon taught, when the time came for the Holy One of Blessing to create the first human being, the ministering angels broke into sects and factions. One opposed creating the human, and one in support. Compassion said, "Create, for they will do many acts of loving kindness." Justice said, "Create, for they will do great acts of justice." Peace said, "Do not create, for they are a quarrelsome bunch." And truth agreed, saying, "Do not create them, for they, every one of them, are liars." What did the Holy One of Blessing do? God took truth and cast him down out of the heavens and then created the human. of these divine embodiments, compassion, justice, and peace all remain in the heavens. But as we read in Deuteronomy, truth is not in heaven. Of the divine attributes, truth is the one that God cast down, diminishing its stature and distancing it from its source. Truth wanders the terrestrial plane, fractured and forever limited. Hillel and Shammai, two of the greatest of Talmudic rabbis, disagreed about every single thing. Their intellectual and political battles pepper the pages as our sages search for truth. And they came down on the other side of the aisle on every issue. How should we light Hanukkah candles? What are the conditions for divorce? And is lying ever okay? And God ends up saying, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim. Both of these rabbis' words are the words of the living God, mutually exclusive, yet coexisting truths. And yet, the Talmud is not post-truth. We follow Hillel on every single issue. And so we would assume that Hillel always had the better arguments, that his was, of course, the perspective of justice, that his was surely the better truth. But that's not the reason why. The Talmud goes out of its way to say that Hillel didn't prevail because he had the better arguments. Rather, Hillel always had his students first study the arguments and ideas of Shammai before ever turning to his own. Hillel wanted his students to learn the truths of Shammai because it would keep them humble. He wanted his students to be a certain kind of people, not win a certain kind of argument. And for this reason, we follow his teachings. And even beyond this, the sages relay that the children of Hillel and Shammai married one another. That both Hillel and Shammai actually placed humanity and unity on an even higher pedestal than truth, mirroring the divine image of that midrash. Dr. Leon Festinger summarized decades of research in social psychology when he put out his book, When Prophecy Fails. He writes, "A man with a conviction is a hard man to change. Tell him you disagree and he turns away. Show him facts or figures and he questions your sources. Appeal to logic and he fails to see your point. Suppose that he is presented with evidence, unequivocal and undeniable evidence that his belief is wrong. What will happen? The individual will frequently emerge not only unshaken, but even more convinced of the truth of his beliefs than ever before. We have ingrained in us a bias to believe what we have always believed. For many, we see this manifested by our religious readership of the newspaper we believe most accurate. We watch the news station we believe best captures reality, and we curate our social media for comfort. For those of us who have dropped subscriptions or unfollowed Facebook friends, we know how easy it is today to create a nice, cushiony cave of information that supports our own understandings. And as many of us in this day and age cling to our Kindles and halls of learning for guidance, it is so important that we note that greater intelligence and greater education even correlates with more bias, not less. And as Scientific American reported last year, when we encounter a perspective on truth, it will likely only reinforce whatever understanding we already held. All of this research challenges so many of the ways we connect to the world of ideas, from articles to reports and even to this sermon. In these minutes of my words, some of you may be nodding consciously or unconsciously, finding affirmation of ideas you already held. Others may already be finding reasons to reject these words on the ground of my faulty thinking, incomplete information, or simply my rabbinic ignorance. One of the most powerful ways to counter our ingrained confirmation bias is to look to the wisdom found in crowds, as accuracy of knowledge tends to be highest in a larger pool of people. The trouble is that the wisdom of crowds fails when the crowd is homogeneous. That is, it is our diversity in belief and perspective that can offer the clearest lens into data and ideas. And yet, more than ever, we are separating into ideological tribalism. In an era of greater access to information than ever in history, we have more and more information strengthening our own beliefs and dividing us into like-minded thought bubbles. And sadly, such homogeneity dulls our wisdom. My aunt, uncle, and cousins live in the settlement of Elon Shvut, deep in the heart of Israel's West Bank. With a population of 3,000 and growing, the settlement's beauty and tranquility mask a deep fear that ripples in the hearts of its citizens. Violence and murder have plagued Elon Shvut, and its proximity to Palestinian villages makes it a crucible-like microcosm of a larger conflict. But I want to tell the story of two people. One of my family's next-door neighbors is a rabbi named Hanan Schlesinger, a religious Zionist, one who proudly served in the IDF and devoted his life to the land and people of Israel. Schlesinger found himself surrounded by like-minded Israelis in the tight-knit community there of Elon Shvut. In 2013, he was invited, along with a dozen other members of the settlement, to be a part of an experimental dialogue with their Palestinian neighbors. It would require walking just 15 minutes outside of the settlement into a nearby village. Though Palestinians make up 90% of that region of the West Bank, Rabbi Schlesinger recalls never having met a single one of them. He described the reaction from fellow Israelis and his own anxiety. What are you doing, risking your life talking to them? They're bloodthirsty killers. What could possibly benefit you or anyone else from talking to them? Schlesinger writes that the next 2 hours were the most impactful moments of his life. 30 Israelis and Palestinians stood together in a circle in dialogue, the only rules being no persuading, no defending, and no interrupting. Not easy rules for Israelis. Schlesinger listened to stories and then had the chance to share his own. He was astounded to learn from one Palestinian neighbor of the fear that so many of the children in the nearby villages have, that people that look like him, that bearded settlers with rifles strapped to their shoulders, are what they portray as the boogeyman. The Israeli settlers spoke of the murder of Jews near Elon Shvut and the constant fear their own children face daily, surrounded by those who wish them dead, about the experience of living with neighbors who want to push them into the sea. As the night progressed, the numbers thinned, and soon only Schlesinger stood with Ali Abu Awad, a man who had been a militant during the First Intifada. Schlesinger recalls, "I wanted to complement my old lens with a new one. Even though we may see the other as aggressive and dangerous and bloodthirsty, those paradigms keep me safe because they teach me that I'm living in a world that I understand. When one starts to realize those paradigms that you've been taught your whole life are not the only truth, then life absolutely becomes much, much more dangerous. Not in a physical sense, but in a spiritual and psychological sense. It's a mind-expanding and soul-expanding experience because you realize that you're in a process of actually expanding your sense of what is true and what is right." Geographic neighbors and zealous enemies, and they stood together bearing witness to one another. Over the course of months, Awad and Schlesinger formed a close friendship and engaged in a longer, deeper, more complex dialogue, one that pushed them to imagine the possibility of a different path forward. And so together they decided to establish the organization Roots, a Palestinian-Israeli initiative for understanding. And together they now speak around the globe. And it all started by hearing biography rather than only ideology, in perceiving the person behind the politics and hearing the human behind the horror. But even as partners and friends, this is not the story of Pollyanna. Schlesinger remains a passionate settler. Awad still vehemently opposes Israeli occupation. The two debate and argue in every single conversation they have, and they see the daunting, long road before them. But now there is something more, something that they actually share, something that unites them. Awad reflects, "It starts by realizing the other is not my enemy, but rather our respective fears are the enemy. With conversation, we have the possibility to see the human before us. I'm not always optimistic, but I am a believer in what I'm doing and where we're heading." And so, slowly but slowly, change is happening. Their friends and families now gather together regularly. More and more people from Elon Shvut and its neighboring villages are joining in dialogue. And now Awad and Schlesinger's words and example ripple in communities around the world. Just over 50 years ago, in an essay called "The Vocation of the Cantor," Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel asked the question, what does a person expect to attain when entering a synagogue? In pursuit of learning, one goes to a library. For pure music, one goes to the concert hall. What then is the purpose of going to the synagogue? Heschel's response is this: that in the synagogue we should cultivate a sense of humanity. It is here that we elevate being a mensch as our most prestigious aspiration. Here, our stories matter, where each person is needed, where every person is necessary. In our diversity of perspective, we become wiser. In our humility of belief, we transcend possibly even our own bias. And in relationship with those with whom we disagree, we live out the heart of our tradition's take on truth. It must always serve the higher values of compassion, righteousness, and peace. We need this synagogue, perhaps more than ever, and need this to be a bastion of diversity and transcendent humanity. So what evolves belief? What may indeed bring us together? According to a team of scientists from Princeton, it may be something as simple and profound as sharing our stories, as they found that it may be, in the sharing of stories, one of the most impactful ways to create space for shared perspective and feeling. In holding relationship, even with deep tension and disagreement, we come to see the humanity in difference, in hearing the biography, not just the ideology. We may even find deeper shared values that otherwise remain hidden. For many of us, when we see a political position not our own, our desire is to vanquish the opposition in private debate or in the polls. And in the short run, we may indeed be able to shape a larger landscape towards our sense of justice. And then what? Because even if the votes and debate go our way, our country's division will remain. The bifurcation of belief will persist. So what vision could possibly rebuild some shared ground of our country and our community? It would take 10 years after being liberated from Buchenwald before Elie Wiesel would attempt to speak into a world that had fallen apart. As a witness to the most extreme atrocities, he became a scribe and a storyteller, in words bringing his truth into a world of chaos. After publishing Night, he began a lifetime as an activist, and he changed the way we think about humanity and the way we understand our responsibility to each other. Later in life, he would remark, "I know, and I speak from experience, that even in the midst of darkness, it is possible to create light and share warmth with one another. That even on the edge of the abyss, it is possible to dream exalted dreams of compassion. That even in exile, friendship may become an anchor. To remain human in the face of absurd inhumanity is the real message of Judaism. I believe in language, although it has been distorted, corrupted, and poisoned. I still cling to words, for it is we who decide whether they become spears or balm, carriers of bigotry or vehicles of understanding, whether they are used to curse or to heal, whether they are here to cause shame or to give comfort. I belong to a generation that has learned that whatever the question, despair is not an answer. Whatever the experience, indifference is not an option. Our sages taught, in a place where there is no human, be human. In the face of inhumanity, bring humanity. That is where it begins. Such a value transcends even truth. In the small, even quiet acts in which we force ourselves to face another. In hearing the biography, not the ideology. If Wiesel can reach for the spark of humanity even in the face of absolute atrocity, all the more reason why we must be the torchbearers of it, no matter how polarized the perspectives. And like him, like the path of our tradition for thousands of years, our path forward may be found in hearing story. The stories of people and their struggles. The stories that remind us of shared values. The stories that remind us to be human, to be humane. That is our charge. There are truths others hold that I do not and likely never will come to understand. We hear flippant and frequent urges to understand the truth of another. But not everything is truth, nor can all truths be grasped. But ours is a tradition that holds a grander, higher ideal before our eyes: humanity. I may never understand the truth of the grandfather who will not speak to me. You may recall the injustices of a colleague or friend placed upon you long ago. We may argue and debate who is at fault in the fractures of our personal lives and our political landscape. But there is something higher than truth. Have I been willing to see the humanity in the world around me? Have I created the space for biography in a storm of ideology? Do I duck people of difference? Have I challenged myself to sit with a person of different ideology and political persuasion and pause long enough to simply listen for humanity, no matter how deeply buried it may be? This year at Road of Shalom, we are attempting to expand the ways we can both embrace our diversity and elevate our humanity. For some, we feel pride at the actions and positions of this congregation, but for others, we may feel silenced or marginalized. I've sat with members of our community horrified that we are not more vocal about some issues, and sat with others equally horrified by the platforms we hold dear. Believing we are wiser with diversity does not negate our responsibility to hold conviction as a congregation, but it also necessitates that we create a space of belonging for those who disagree and invite such perspectives to be heard and witnessed. For those interested in creating a space to delve into the complexities and possibilities of Israel, we invite you to join us for a training with Resetting the Table, an organization dedicated to encouraging difficult conversations through active listening. At a time when Israel is one of the most polarizing topics amongst American Jews, we see Jewish institutions struggling for space for real learning and deep dialogue on this sacred issue. Join us in this new experiment and help us raise our sense of discourse within these walls. And as Minyan enters its second year, we already see that these small affinity groups of 10 congregants create a sacred space in which connection becomes our highest and deepest purpose. Last year, we had over 200 members of our community involved in these small groups. And for many, it was the first environment in which diversity of discourse could be surfaced, where relationship was not threatened. deepening our wisdom demands elevating our humanity. It is difficult, even painful, to sit with ideologies that may negate our own identity and our most preciously held values. But in Wiesel's words, in the long run, our only path forward is with the human before us. For those of you hearing these words and feel a sense of resonance, please let me know and join me in dreaming new ways to create space so this may be a house of prayer for all people. And for those of you who found these words fell short or offended, I would greatly appreciate the chance to sit with you, to hear your story, and learn from you. We stand in the midst of the rubble of truth. Like the rabbinic imagination, it has been cast down from the heavens in ruin. But our tradition reminds us that there are values even more important that remain our heavenly aspirations. In his final written words to the world, Senator John McCain proclaimed this very idea. We are citizens of the world's greatest republic, a nation of ideals, not blood and soil. We weaken our greatness when we confuse our patriotism with tribal rivalries that have sown resentment and hatred and violence in all corners of the globe. We are 325 million opinionated, vociferous individuals, but we have always had so much more in common with each other than in disagreement. If only we remember that and give each other the benefit of the presumption that we all love our country, then we will get through these challenging times. We will come through them stronger than before, even, for we always do. We are at our wisest when we sit in relationship with difference. May the example of our sages ring loudly today. As we debate that which divides us, may we also reach for that which unites us. May we dare to listen, and in the process reach towards the heavenly virtue of compassion. And as we stand before the Judge of Truth this Yom Kippur, may we all reach towards the highest of our values, our humanity. Shana Tova. At this time, it's an honor to invite to the Bima Cindy and Brian Gavin for the honor of opening the Ark. And invite the community to please turn to page 252 as we rise for Avinu Malkeinu.